3 frames, a shape the length of a bus, lying on the floor of a shallow bay. Dark, striped, motionless. The photographs were taken in December of 1964 at Hook Island, Queensland, a remote anchorage with no harbour, no witnesses, and no way to verify what anyone claimed. The case was reported, logged, filed. No investigation was ever opened. The original negatives were never examined. The footage shot that same morning was never released. So what did the man who took these photographs know before he ever reached that bay? December of 1964 was unusually calm along the Whitsunday coast of Queensland, Australia. The wet season had not yet broken. The sea sat flat and pale green in the mornings, barely disturbed by the small craft that moved between the islands. Hook Island rose from the water about 70 kilometres offshore, a steep forested mass with no permanent settlement, no harbour, no telephone line. Its bays were used occasionally by fishermen and, increasingly in those years, by amateur sailors and adventurers who came to dive and photograph the reef. Robert Le Serrec arrived at Stonehaven Bay on the northern side of Hook Island sometime in the first week of December. He was French-born, in his late 30s, and had been living in Australia for roughly 2 years. He travelled with his wife Janine, their 2 young children, and a family friend named Henk de Jong, a Dutch national who had joined the trip as a second adult for safety on open water. Their vessel was a small motorised boat, a modest craft, the kind used for coastal recreation, with an outboard engine and enough room for 5 people and basic supplies. They had come, Le Serrec later said, simply to enjoy the islands and take photographs. Stonehaven Bay is a sheltered inlet on the northwestern face of Hook Island, protected from the open coral sea by a ridge of forested hills. The water there runs shallow close to shore, sandy floored, clear enough in calm weather to see the bottom from a standing position in the boat. There is no jetty, no mooring, no structure of any kind. A vessel anchoring in that bay in December of 1964 would have been entirely alone. No one would pass. No one would see what happened there. The party had been at anchor for at least a day before the encounter, by Le Serrec's account. The children had been in the water. Janine had been photographing the reef close to shore. De Jong had been helping with the boat. It was an ordinary morning, overcast, with the light diffuse and flat across the surface. Le Serrec said he spotted the shape from the stern while making a slow pass across the bay. He cut the engine. The boat drifted. The shape did not move. What Le Serrec described finding on the floor of Stonehaven Bay was this: a creature lying motionless in the shallows, partially visible through the surface of the water. It was enormous. He estimated its length at approximately 25 to 30 feet. Its body was shaped, he said, like a tadpole, wide at the head and tapering toward a long, thin tail. The skin appeared dark, striped with lighter bands running across the back. The head was flat. The mouth was slightly open. It did not move. Le Serrec reached for his camera. He and de Jong photographed the creature from the boat, circling slowly to get multiple angles. In the photographs that survive, the shape is clearly visible beneath the water. A long, dark mass with a defined outline, lying against the pale sand of the bay floor. The images are not crisp. The water diffuses the light, softening the edges. But the shape is there, and it is large, and it does not look like anything in the standard marine catalogues of 1964. Then Le Serrec did something that, later, would become the most discussed detail of the entire case. He and de Jong entered the water. They swam toward the creature with a movie camera, an 8mm film unit, standard equipment for amateur documentation in that era. Their intent, Le Serrec said, was to get closer footage. They approached the head. At some point, the creature appeared to open its mouth more fully and make a movement. The 2 men retreated to the boat. According to Le Serrec, Janine had remained aboard with the children throughout. The creature, he said, then slowly submerged and disappeared. The film footage, if it existed, was never publicly released in any verifiable form. What reached the press and the scientific community were the still photographs, 3 primary images that Le Serrec brought to the attention of journalists in Queensland in early 1965. The story spread quickly. Within weeks, the photographs were being discussed in marine biology circles and in the offices of magazines that covered unexplained phenomena. Dr. Owen Marsh, a marine biologist based in Brisbane who was contacted by a journalist named Margaret Pryor, examined copies of the images. His response was cautious. He noted that the shape was consistent with a large animal of some kind, but that the image quality made precise identification impossible. He could not rule out a known species. He could not confirm one either. He recommended that the site be investigated. No formal investigation was ever conducted. Constable Alan Briggs, stationed at the closest mainland post in Proserpine, received a brief written account from Le Serrec in early January of 1965. He forwarded it to the Queensland Marine Department. The department logged the report and took no further action. There is no record of any official attempt to revisit Stonehaven Bay, to examine the sea floor, or to interview de Jong independently of Le Serrec. What there is, instead, is a financial record, a small one, but specific enough to matter. Several months before the Hook Island trip, Robert Le Serrec had reportedly approached at least one Australian publication about a potential exclusive deal. Photographs of something unusual, something that would generate significant press interest. The details of that approach were noted by Margaret Pryor in her working notes, which she later referenced in a short piece she wrote for a Queensland regional paper. She did not name the publication Le Serrec had contacted. She described the conversation as preliminary and inconclusive, but the timing was clear. Le Serrec had been seeking a buyer before the photographs existed. That detail, quiet, almost administrative, sits at the center of everything that followed. To understand why the Hook Island photographs refused to disappear, it helps to understand what the Australian coast looked like to a foreign adventurer in 1964. The Whitsunday Islands were not yet a tourist destination in any organized sense. There were no resort hotels on the outer islands, no regular ferry service, no dive operators running day trips to the reef. The area was mapped and legally administered, but physically remote. A small boat could anchor in a bay like Stonehaven for 3 or 4 days without encountering another vessel. The nearest authority with the equipment to verify any claim was more than an hour away by fast boat. Reaching anyone with actual jurisdiction took several hours more. Le Serrec understood this geography. He had been sailing the Queensland coast long enough to know which bays were isolated, which channels were shallow, and where a boat could sit undisturbed. Whatever happened in Stonehaven Bay, whether it was discovery or construction, the location was chosen well. The photographs themselves, when examined carefully, present a specific problem that no enthusiast account and no skeptical dismissal has ever fully resolved. The problem is scale. In 2 of the 3 primary images, the creature's outline is visible against the sandy floor of the bay. The water depth appears to be between 6 and 10 feet, based on the visibility and the angle of the surface light. If those depth estimates are correct, and if the creature's body extends the length that Le Serrec claimed, between 25 and 30 feet, then the object in the photographs is genuinely large. Not ambiguously large. Specifically, measurably large, in a way that eliminates the most common natural explanations. A large ray, for instance, is the animal most frequently proposed as a mundane explanation. But any ray species in those waters would need to be substantially outside its recorded size range to account for the shape in the image. The Queensland coast had documented populations of spotted eagle rays and occasional mantas. Mantas, however, do not sit stationary on the seafloor, and the shape in the photographs is not consistent with a manta's body plan in any case. The outline is elongated. The tail is narrow and very long relative to the head. The head itself is wide and somewhat flat, with what appears to be a slight depression where a mouth would be. Dr. Marsh noted all of this in his assessment. He also noted something else. the texture of the visible skin surface appeared to show banding, alternating dark and lighter stripes running perpendicular to the body's length. He had no reference species that matched that combination of features. He said so plainly. His conclusion was not that the creature was real. His conclusion was that the photographs could not be explained by the obvious candidates, and that without the original negatives and without a site inspection, he could go no further. The original negatives were never made available for independent analysis. Le Serrec retained them. He later sold publication rights to a series of international magazines, including outlets in France and the United States. The financial return from those sales was not publicly disclosed. Margaret Pryor estimated in a later interview that the photographs had generated a sum significant enough to cover at least several months of living expenses for a family of 4. For a man who had arrived in Australia with limited documented income, that was not nothing. Henk de Jong gave one interview to a Dutch-language Australian community newspaper in early 1965. The account he provided matched Le Serrec's in its broad outline. The creature was there. It was large. They approached it. It moved. They left. De Jong was not asked detailed follow-up questions. He was not contacted again by any researcher or journalist for years afterward. When a British marine biology journal attempted to reach him in 1967 for a brief note on the case, the address they had on file was no longer current. His subsequent whereabouts were not publicly known. The absence of de Jong as an ongoing, accessible witness created a vacuum that the case never recovered from. In most documented encounters of this kind, sightings of unusual animals, unexplained events at sea, the presence of multiple witnesses who can be separately interviewed is the primary tool for establishing baseline credibility. If 2 people, questioned independently, give accounts that match on the specific physical details without matching on the incidental ones, that is meaningful. It suggests genuine shared experience rather than coordinated storytelling. De Jong was never independently questioned in any rigorous way. He was present, and then he was elsewhere, and his version of events remained permanently attached to Le Serrec's rather than standing on its own. What survived independently was the shape in the water. Still there, still unexplained. A marine photographer named Colin Bassett, working for a Queensland diving magazine in 1966, revisited Stonehaven Bay specifically to examine the seafloor. He found no animal, no remains, no marks in the sediment. He also found no object large enough to have produced the silhouette in Le Serrec's photographs, if the shape had been artificial. No weighted tarpaulin anchor points, no submerged framework. He wrote a short note for the magazine concluding that the bay showed no physical evidence, either confirming or disproving the encounter. The sediment had been disturbed, he noted, by normal tidal activity over the preceding year and a half. Any trace of what had been there in December of 1964 was gone. The seafloor had been reset. The photographs remained. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in Brisbane, Margaret Pryor kept a specific note. It recorded a conversation that had happened before any of this, about a man looking for a buyer before he had anything to sell. By 1968, the Hook Island photographs had been reproduced in at least 11 countries. They appeared in French science magazines, in American paperbacks about unexplained phenomena, in a British compendium of sea monster reports that sold moderately well in university bookshops. Each reproduction carried the same caption, some variation of photographed, December 1964, Hook Island, Queensland, Australia. Photographer, Robert Le Serrec. The images had acquired the weight of documentation simply through repetition. When something appears in enough places attributed to the same source, it begins to feel verified, even when the verification never actually happened. This is the mechanism that Margaret Pryor identified in her unpublished notes from that period. She was not a marine biologist, and did not claim to be. She was a journalist who had spent enough years covering regional stories in Queensland to recognize the difference between a fact that had been confirmed and a fact that had simply been repeated. The Le Serrec photographs, she wrote, were the second kind. Every article that cited them cited a previous article. The chain of references, if you followed it all the way back, ended at Le Serrec himself. There was no independent point of origin. There was only the man and the pictures he said he had taken and the story he told about how he came to take them. Pryor attempted to trace Le Serrec's movements in the months before the Hook Island trip. What she found was partial and, in places, contradictory. Le Serrec had entered Australia in 1962 on a tourist visa and had subsequently obtained residency through a process she could not fully document from public records. He had lived in at least 3 locations in Queensland between 1962 and 1964. Brisbane, then a coastal town north of Mackay, then a period that was difficult to place precisely. He had worked, by his own account, as a photographer and freelance journalist. His published work from that period was sparse, a handful of nature photographs in regional magazines, one short piece about reef diving. What he had not done, as far as Pryor could establish, was build any reputation in the field of marine documentation before December of 1964. He was not known to marine researchers. He was not affiliated with any diving organization or photographic society. He had no documented prior encounters with unusual animals. He was, in every professional sense, unknown, until the moment the photographs appeared. The proposition that Pryor kept returning to in her notes was not that Le Serrec had fabricated everything. It was more specific than that. She believed the photographs showed something real, an actual object in actual water. What she doubted was the story of how it came to be there. The construction hypothesis, as it came to be discussed among the small circle of researchers who engaged seriously with the case in the late 1960s, went roughly as follows. A large, flat shape, perhaps a tarpaulin or canvas sheeting weighted at the edges, could be submerged in shallow, calm water. Photographed from above, it would produce an outline consistent with a large animal. The banding visible on the object's surface could be achieved with paint, or with the natural variation in how different materials reflect underwater light. The tail, which in the photographs appears narrower than the body and extends to a point, could be constructed from a single length of flexible material and would hold its shape in still water. The whole assembly, if weighted correctly, would lie flat against the seafloor and appear, from a boat, to be a solid, 3-dimensional creature resting in the shallows. No one who examined the photographs was able to definitively confirm this explanation. But no one was able to rule it out either. The critical variable, depth, could not be independently verified from the images alone, and Le Serrec had not provided any documentation of the bay conditions on the day of the encounter. No tide tables, no depth soundings, no weather log from the boat. For a man who described himself as a careful and professional photographer, the absence of any supporting technical record was, Pryor noted, unusual. Captain Ted Forsyth, a Queensland Marine Safety officer who had patrolled the Whitsunday region throughout the 1960s, was interviewed by a researcher in 1971. He had not been on duty near Hook Island in December of 1964, and he had no direct knowledge of Le Serrec's visit. But he spoke to the general conditions of Stonehaven Bay with some authority. He described it as a sheltered anchorage, protected from prevailing winds by the island's topography. The floor in the central portion of the bay was sandy, with depths ranging from roughly 4 to 12 feet, depending on the tide. In calm conditions, he said, visibility through the water was excellent. A person in a small boat could see the floor clearly in the shallower sections. Those conditions, shelter, visibility, a sandy floor at manageable depth, were precisely the conditions you would want if you were placing something on the seafloor and then photographing it from above. Forsyth was careful to say that he was not accusing anyone of anything. He was describing the bay, but the description fit the hypothesis with a precision that was difficult to set aside. The movie footage was the element that should have resolved everything and never did. Le Serrec had stated clearly that he and de Jong had entered the water with an 8mm camera. If that footage existed and was clear, it would show either a living animal or an object. It would show the creature from a different angle than the still photographs. It would capture motion, or the absence of it. It would be, in the language of documentary evidence, decisive. The footage was described by Le Serrec as too dark and too blurred to be useful. He did not release it. He did not submit it for independent assessment. He did not provide the original film reel to any researcher or institution. The footage, like de Jong, like the original negatives, remained in Le Serrec's possession, present enough to be cited, absent enough to be examined. That pattern, evidence described but not produced, was the detail that Pryor underlined twice in her notes. Not once, twice. Here is what is certain about the Hook Island case. In December of 1964, Robert Le Serrec anchored in Stonehaven Bay on the northern side of Hook Island, Queensland, Australia. He produced 3 still photographs showing a large, elongated shape visible beneath the surface of shallow water. He reported that he and Henk de Jong entered the water to film the object with a movie camera. He brought the still photographs to public attention in early 1965 and sold reproduction rights to multiple publications across several countries. No independent investigation of the site was conducted by any government authority. The original negatives were never submitted for independent forensic analysis. The movie footage was never released. Henk de Jong gave one brief, unverified interview and then became effectively unreachable. No other witnesses to the encounter have ever been identified. Those are the facts. Everything else is interpretation. The version of events most consistent with the available evidence is not the one that appears in the magazines that reproduce the photographs. It is not the one that describes a startled family stumbling across a living mystery in an Australian bay. The version most consistent with the evidence is this. Robert Le Serrec arrived at Hook Island with a plan, not a camera. The shape in the photographs was placed there, constructed, weighted, and submerged in advance in a bay chosen for its isolation, its shallow, sandy floor, and its protection from wind and current. The photographs were taken from the boat to maximize the apparent scale of the object and to keep the image surface slightly blurred, which reduced the risk of the material's texture being identifiable. The approach in the water with the movie camera was staged, brief, and designed to add a layer of apparent credibility to the account. The footage was never released because it showed, at closer range, something that could not survive scrutiny. This hypothesis fits the pre-trip approach to a publication buyer. It fits the absence of any supporting technical documentation from the boat. It fits the unavailability of the original negatives. It fits de Jong's rapid disappearance from the public record. And it fits most precisely the financial outcome. A man with no established reputation in marine photography or wildlife documentation generated, from a single December trip to a remote bay, enough income to sustain his family for months. He also secured enough international exposure to have his name attached to one of the most reproduced mystery photographs of the 20th century. What the hypothesis does not fit is the scale problem. That problem remains. If the depth estimates derived from the photographs are correct, the object in the images is genuinely large. Larger, in fact, than any tarpaulin or canvas construction that could be managed by 2 adults in a small recreational boat without specialized equipment or outside assistance. That discrepancy has never been satisfactorily resolved by the fabrication argument. It is the reason that the case has continued to attract serious attention, even from researchers who are otherwise skeptical of the encounter narrative. There are 2 ways to read that discrepancy. The first is that the depth estimates are wrong, that the water was shallower than it appears, and the object was smaller than it looks. Under that reading, the scale problem dissolves with more careful photographic analysis. The second is that something genuinely unusual was in that bay, and that Le Serrec, whatever his motivations, photographed it accurately. Neither reading has been proven with certainty, but the weight of the circumstantial record, the pre-trip buyer approach, the withheld negatives, the vanished footage, the inaccessible witness, sits more heavily on one side of the scale than the other. The consequences of the case, such as they are, settled quietly. No marine authority changed its survey protocols for the Whitsunday Islands as a result of the encounter. No university research program was initiated. No dive team was formally dispatched. The Queensland Marine Department's log entry from January of 1965, a single paragraph summarising Constable Briggs's forwarded report, remained the entirety of the official record. The case was not investigated. It was not closed. It was simply not pursued. Cases without institutional champions die that way, not through decision, but through accumulated indifference, until the original question is buried under everything that came after. Robert Le Serrec left Australia in the late 1960s. His subsequent whereabouts were documented only intermittently. The photographs continued to circulate without him. They appeared in books published in the 1970s and 1980s, each time attributed to the same December in the same bay. Each time they were reproduced from a previous reproduction rather than from the original negatives. The image degraded slightly with each generation of copying, the outline growing softer, the banding less distinct, the shape becoming more ambiguous as the decades accumulated. And yet it persisted because the question it posed persisted. Not whether the creature was real, but whether the photograph was honest, and whether, in the end, those two questions are actually the same question at all. The original negatives remain unexamined. The movie footage remains unseen. Henk de Jong's full account remains unrecorded. And the only official document generated by the entire affair was a single paragraph in a Queensland Marine Department log from January of 1965. It contains no conclusion, no follow-up, and no assigned investigator's name. If the photographs were fabricated, someone in that department decided the case was not worth the cost of a boat trip to find out. If they were genuine, that same decision carried a different weight. Whatever was in Stonehaven Bay in December of 1964 was allowed to remain, permanently, in the category of things seen once and never confirmed. Either way, the same question goes unanswered. Who in that department decided a case this documented was not worth investigating?